Face the Nation on CBS News with Margaret Brennan. Is it fair or is it biased? Let's find out. So Face the Nation covered the Dobbs versus Jackson decision. As you recall, that decision overturned Roe versus Wade. A huge decision, landmark decision by the Supreme Court, which obviously affects people nationwide and really pushes the abortion issue to the states. So a fair thing to talk about. So what Face the Nation did was they brought on a Democrat governor, who was Gretchen Whitmer out of Michigan, and a Republican governor named Kristi Noem out of South Dakota. They brought them on one after another. Now what I'm going to do in these clips is I'm going to jump between these two interviews back and forth to better illustrate the difference in the tenor and the language used in the questions which are posed to these two governors. So it'll be a little confusing that way because we'll jump back and forth, but I think it's helpful to do it in that way. So as you recall on these things, what we do is we score them on, do they give equal time to both sides? And what we'll find out is that they actually gave 10.5 minutes to the Republican, 7.5 minutes to the Democrat. That's 58% of the time goes to the Republicans, so it does favor the Republicans by a score of +1 to the Republicans. The next question is the story selection fair? Dobbs versus Jackson is a landmark decision. It's fair to cover that. I'll give it a neutral on the story selection. The last question is the language used, or how does the host handle that type of information. I'm not really going to focus in this about how did Gretchen Whitmer respond, how did Kristi Noem respond, because we have a Republican and a Democrat, and of course they're going to talk their own talking points. They know what their party position is and they're going to stick to that. So we're going to focus on just the questions only. So I'm going to start with the first question to the Republican governor, then we'll go to the Democrat, Republican, Democrat. We'll kind of go that way. They actually ask more questions to the Democrats, so we'll run out of questions for Republicans. Even though the Republican got more time, there was less questions posed. So let's start with the first question, which was posed to Kristi Noem, Republican governor.
I'm hoping you can clarify some things, because I know under South Dakota law, abortions are now criminal acts. Only exceptions if it's necessary to preserve the life of a pregnant female. You're calling a special session. What exactly do you want to change or implement here?
Fair question. What exactly do you want to implement here? No bias in that. Fair question, just asking how are you going to proceed forward. Let's see where she starts with the Democrat now.
So in your state, abortion is still temporarily available due to a court injunction on a 1931 law that was already on your books that would outlaw it with no exceptions for rape or incest. I know there's confusion in your state. What exactly is the status of your appeal to the state Supreme Court?
Fair question. She just asks, where are you going? What do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish? There's no bias in that question whatsoever. Now let's go to the second question of the Republican. So we're going to jump back. Kristi Noem went first. Gretchen Whitmer went second. So we'll jump back in time and look at that second question.
On that, though, America has the worst maternal mortality rate of any developed country. What specifically are you doing for these women who, not just when they have the baby, but during their pregnancy? Are you giving them paid leave? Are you giving them more health care rights in your state? Are you giving them more state funding? What exactly are you doing to keep them alive during their pregnancy?
All right, so she starts with, America has the worst maternal fatality rates of any developed country. Now, what Margaret Brennan forgets to mention in that is America has some of the loosest abortion laws of any developed country, right? Prior to Dobbs versus Jackson, at least. And so what is the logical sequitur of this? It makes no sense. That question is merely a Democrat talking point. The Democrat talking point is we must keep abortion legal because we don't give enough government benefits to women who become pregnant. There's not enough free birth control. There's not enough free health care. There's not enough free things from the government. That's the Democrat talking point. But it really makes no logical sense. And so this is definitely a biased question, a loaded question, and really favors the Democrat side. Really shows that Margaret Brennan has really focused on the Democrat talking points in her preparation for this and really hasn't paid attention to any of the Republican talking points. Now let's go to the next question to the Democrat governor and see how friendly or hostile that question is.
So what happens if you lose?
At first blush, this might seem to be unbiased, but I'm going to call it biased because it's really a soft ball. The Democrat talking point after Dobbs versus Jackson has been that the sky is falling. This is the worst thing that could have happened. It's going to be a disaster. People are going to be dying. Women are going to be dying. It's an awful, awful thing. Our rights are being taken away. And this is a softball to Gretchen Whitmer to allow her to say all of those things. And she's a smart person. She takes Margaret Brennan up on that and says those things and trashes Republicans in the process. So it is a biased question. It is a softball question. Now let's look at the next question to the Republican governor.
So you're still figuring out the specifics.
So you're still figuring out the specifics. Very hostile, very negative, very condescending, very insulting, really, as though, hey, you're not answering this right. You know, Kristi Noem was sticking with the Republican talking points in her answer, which is, you know, we may not agree or disagree with that, but that's typically what is done. And reporters, for the most part, seem like they go along with it, but not Margaret Brennan in this instance. She was very condescending, very dismissive of that response. Now let's see the next question she asked of the Democrat.
So in every state, now state capitals are going to make these decisions. So I want to get to the specifics. Roe versus Wade previously guaranteed abortion up to viability, roughly 24 weeks of pregnancy. If the courts strike down this ban you are fighting, and you have to craft a new law here, is there a compromise that is possible here? Can you settle on 20 weeks, 15 weeks, anything less than Roe?
All right, another softball question. Is there any room for compromise? Can you guess how a Democrat governor is going to answer this? Obviously, the response is the Republicans are too radical, they're too intransigent, they're not willing to compromise, they're out of control, please come out and vote Democrat. And that's exactly how the question is answered. It's a softball question. Now let's go to the next question to the Republican and see if it's as equally a softball.
So there's a lot of confusion here. So South Dakota is one of 30 states that will limit access to telemedicine abortions, which allow patients to receive these pills in the mail that would allow them to end their pregnancy. The president has said he's going to use the Justice Department to intervene here if there's an attempt to stop women from receiving these pills. Are you prepared for that kind of legal battle? Are you actually going to seize mail? How would you stop women from actually receiving this federally approved medication?
All right, it's getting more and more obvious, isn't it? These are not equal questions. Is South Dakota going to start seizing mail? Is South Dakota going to be draconian to these women? Is South Dakota going to be an awful state to live in? I mean, that's kind of the undertone. She's not saying it exactly like that, but that's kind of the idea that Margaret Brennan's putting across here. It's not the same tenor. It's not the same language. It's not the same questions that are being asked to the Democrat governor. Now let's go to the Democrat governor and see what Margaret Brennan asks.
So according to the CBS polling, most recent we did, most Americans feel abortion should be legal within the first trimester, so 12 weeks of pregnancy, roughly. A third say it should be legal after that as well. If you're saying you can't talk this out with your state legislature, can you at least, put it on the ballot? Does the public get to decide here? How do you move forward?
Margaret Brennan now shows a Democrat governor a poll which supports what the Democrat governor wants to do, right? For some reason, Margaret Brennan doesn't show her a Michigan poll. She shows her a nationwide poll, and I don't know why that is. Maybe there is no good Michigan poll available, but it's a softball question because the poll supports what Governor Whitmer wants. It's an easy question for her, and again, an opportunity to trash Republicans, which she does.
A doctor over the internet or over the phone could prescribe an abortion for an individual because these are very dangerous medical procedures. A woman is 5 times more likely to end up in an emergency room if they're utilizing this kind of
This is an
method for an
FDA-approved
abortion.
drug.
So it's something that should be under the supervision of a medical doctor, and it is something in
Right.
South Dakota that we've made sure happens that way.
But that's what I'm
I think
asking you for
that these
specifics of,
discussions
because
are at the state level.
Because at the
and
state
that's
level,
the debate that
right, but what is happening here is incredibly important and precedent setting. This is a federally approved drug. Are you saying the state of South Dakota is now going to overrule the FDA and decide which drugs are going to be available to its residents?
Now, as you recall, Margaret Brennan originally asked Kristi Noem what they were going to do to keep women safe. Remember that? And this is a couple questions later, but Kristi Noem throws that back in her face and says, we're not going to allow abortion via telemedicine by mail order because women are 5 times more likely to end up in the emergency room when that happens. So her argument being, we're trying to keep women safe. Margaret Brennan, showing her bias, comes back and says, hey, this is FDA approved. How dare South Dakota get involved in this? South Dakota needs to go along with exactly what the FDA says. A state has no right to regulate medicine or drugs. The FDA controls that. Now, that's a silly argument. When we come back to see Kristi Noem's response, we'll see how she does that, how she handles that. But let's go now to the next question, the Democrat first.
And independents out there, we need them to join this fight.
As you recall, Margaret Brennan threw up a softball pitch to Governor Whitmer, and Governor Whitmer responded by saying, we need more liberal-minded people to come out and vote to affect the state legislature to keep abortion legal. Fair. That's what she's going to do. It was the question that I have the issue with, because Governor Whitmer is a Democrat. Of course, she's going to push for more liberal turnout at the polls. But what's interesting is how Margaret Brennan responds to this.
Right, but then if you put it out there to the public, they've got to pick and make a specific statement here. Is anything less than Roe possible? Is compromise possible?
She goes back to her original line of questioning, is there room for compromise? And I've called that a softball question in the past, and it is a softball question now. Every time she asks this question, Governor Whitmer goes back to trashing Republicans. It's an easy question. It's not asking Governor Whitmer what she's going to do different, how she's going to respond, what she's going to do. It's not criticizing Governor Whitmer for anything that she's done. It's giving Governor Whitmer an opportunity to trash Republicans. It's a softball question, and it's biased. Now let's go to the next question to the Republican governor. Now, as you recall, the last question by Margaret Brennan to the Republican governor was, how dare South Dakota get involved in this issue because the FDA has spoken. So I'm going to start this clip a little early so you can see that, Kristi Noem actually addresses that, and then we're going to watch Margaret Brennan interrupt her.
And many of those decisions are made at the state level. They absolutely are. That's what states do.
Will you stop, if it's sent in mail, will you intercede and stop it from being received?
There's certain protections that are guarded under the Constitution of the United States. The rest of these items are left to the states. The 10th Amendment guarantees us that. What the Supreme Court said was that the Constitution does not give a woman the right to have an abortion. That means that at each state, they will make the decision how they handle these situations.
Exactly. And
in South Dakota, we've already had a bill pass that said on telemedicine abortions that we don't believe it should be available because it is a dangerous situation for those individuals without being medically supervised by a physician.
Okay, so it sounds like you're ready to fight the Justice Department on that one. Let me ask you about something else the president said. He said that his administration will oppose any state governments that try to block the mail, search a person's medicine cabinet, or control a woman's actions by tracking data on apps that she uses. Is South Dakota going to do that kind of surveillance or adopt laws like Oklahoma and Texas have, which incentivize civilians to report on their neighbors?
Margaret, that's never been the conversation in South Dakota, and I don't anticipate that we will ever do that. We take privacy rights very important.
It almost seems like Margaret Brennan knew that her question about the FDA approval was not a good question, because when Kristi Noem pushes back and says, states do this all the time, She then switches to this draconian thing. Are you going to start seizing mail? Are you going to have neighbors report on neighbors? This type of thing. Now let's go to the next question to the Democrat.
But this is a moment where we are seeing how extreme the Michigan GOP has gotten. This radical agenda to deprive women of the ability to make their own most important economic decision they'll make in their lifetime, when and whether or not to have a child.
But I mean, how much do you think that the Democratic Party or Democratic leadership failed here? This was telegraphed for so long. Should the federal government now do more?
I said the previous question was a softball question. I started this clip a little early to make it clear that Governor Whitmer saw it as a softball question and took it up. She starts out by saying the extreme Republicans, this radical agenda. She's taking that softball pitch and knocking it out of the park. She is hitting every Democrat talking point. Now, this is interesting because Margaret Brennan goes to what could be perceived as an anti-Democrat question, a rough question for Democrats, like didn't Democrats fail? Although built into that is this very notion that making most abortions or all abortions illegal is a failure. But from the Democrat perspective, yes, that's true. It is a failure. But again, it's a softball question. And Governor Whitmer will take it up again and just blame Republicans for this.
So how are you going to handle corporations operating in your state that say they will provide health care and financial support to employees who travel out of state for abortions? Are you going to go after those companies or go after those individuals?
No, Margaret, I don't know if you're paying attention to really the debate that's going on in South Dakota. Those aren't the conversations we're having.
So you won't
people in
sue
South
Walmart,
Dakota
for
really
example, or
recognize
Amazon,
that
who
this
operate in your
decision-
state and said that they will do that for their employees. Walmart and Amazon will not face litigation from the state of South Dakota?
We're going to continue to support these mothers, make sure that they are protected from any kind of prosecution that would happen, make sure that these babies are recognized and that every single life is precious, and that we enforce our laws. And I'll continue to make sure that the people of our state know they can speak to their elected representatives that will make those decisions closer to home than what we're seeing at the federal level.
Okay, so I think you were saying you're not going to go after corporations there. Let me just ask you here what a
No
fellow...
intention to do that, Margaret.
Okay. A fellow Republican, Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina, was on this program a few weeks ago, and I want to play something she said because she says she is anti-abortion rights, but she has an exception for rape and incest. Listen to her.
I'm a rape victim myself, and when you realize what's happened in your life, the trauma, the emotional, the mental, the physical trauma in a woman's life, that decision, she should make that decision with her doctor and between her and her God.
How do you respond to her? Are you open to exceptions for rape and incest?
All right, so Margaret Brennan goes down the liberal talking points. She is hitting every one of them. What about going after corporations? Which is funny because normally the liberal talking point isn't to protect corporations, right? They want to portray themselves as being anti-corporation, pro-person, but in this situation, their talking point is the Republicans are draconian because they're going to go after abortion or corporations on abortion issues, and isn't that terrible? That's overbearing, et cetera, et cetera. Kristi Noem responds and says, you're not paying attention to what we're even talking about in South Dakota. Nobody's even brought that up. And then she's kind of, I think, a little condescending when she says, well, you didn't really answer that. But then she brings on this, a little clip on this heart-wrenching story about a woman who's been raped. Again, hitting every liberal talking point. Now let's see when Margaret Brennan goes back to the Democrat governor if she hits any Republican talking points, or does she just stick with the Democrat line?
But you aren't looking for more from the federal government at this time?
No, that is not the Republican talking point. She is not hitting her with any tough questions from the Republican side of this aisle. It's the Democrat talking points. Margaret Brennan has only studied one side of the playbook here, and that is, what can the federal government do to protect abortion rights throughout all 50 states? Now let's go back to the Republican.
Ported into the future.
Exactly, Governor, which is why we asked you here today to try to clarify that, and we'll track it as you figure them out.
Very condescending. and we'll track it as you figure them out, as though she hasn't figured it out already. Very condescending, really almost insulting that she would say that. But I think it clearly shows her bias, Margaret Brennan's bias, Face the Nation's bias, really. Now let's go back. There's three, that's the last question she asks of the Republican, obviously. So we've got a couple more that she asks of the Democrats, so we'll just stick with questions to Gretchen Whitmer now, but let's go back to that.
I want to ask you about this Homeland Security warning that domestic violent extremists may intensify violence. In the bulletin that CBS obtained, it specifically mentioned an incident in Michigan related to a pro-abortion rights group. How concerned are you about violence? What are you seeing on the ground?
Finally, Republican talking point, because the Republican talking point on this is that these pro-abortion activists are going out and committing vandalism and violence against centers which help women who are pregnant, or against centers or places that advocate pro-life issues. So this is definitely hitting on the Republican talking point. It's a question which is more akin to the questions that have been asked of the Republican governor all along. Finally getting to it. So let's go to the next question.
But this warned about threats to federal, state government officials, including judges. Are you concerned about active threats in Michigan?
Governor Whitmer answered the question by going to gun control. This follow-up question is disappointing because really the Republican talking point on this violence issue has been that Democrat politicians specifically have been stoking the hatred and the anger coming from the pro-abortion side or the pro-choice side, and the issue is, will Democrat politicians come out and condemn this behavior? Remember when President Trump was asked so many times to condemn anybody committing violence that was a supporter of President Trump. A follow-up question that would have been more in line with the questions being asked of Governor Noem would have been, will you condemn this level of violence? But that wasn't the question. This question was, are you concerned about violence? Again, it didn't really put Governor Whitmer in a corner. Instead, it just allowed her to come back and continue the liberal talking points, which would be gun control.
And I'm assuming you can't get your state to establish a red flag law at this point, despite the federal incentive.
So, where do we stand? We got more time for the Republican, so I'm going to give +1 to leaning towards Republicans. The subject matter was neutral, so that's a 0. And then the questions, there were some questions that were fair. There was one question which leaned towards Republicans, but all of the rest of the questions leaned Democrat. So the score is +4 towards Democrats. So out of a total of 15 points possible, these two interviews combined on Face the Nation were +3 in favor of Democrats. Thanks for watching. Remember to like or subscribe.